Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there. Just getting a drink of water. Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Rensink. In recent weeks, headlines and news programs have highlighted countless crises concerning water in the West. Reservoirs are at record low levels, with Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the impounded water sources that millions depend on, near dead pool levels where they will cease to provide water or energy. Flooded archaeological sites are resurfacing. Lost boats and other items that were once on lake beds are now in open view. Even dead bodies stuffed into barrels have been found as waters recede. Now is the time to think about water and how we manage it. So this month, we speak with Dr. Christian S. Harrison about his 2021 book, All the Water the Law Allows, Las Vegas and Colorado River Politics. If ever there was an urgent topic for us to consider, this is it. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, allow me to take a moment to explain a bit about Writing Westward and myself. Each episode features a conversation with people writing about the North American West: historians, journalists, novelists, poets, scientists, sociologists, and others. By showcasing their work, I hope to spark your curiosity to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the peoples who call it home. If a writer or topic intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. And if you have a moment, please do subscribe, share links with friends, leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you're using to listen, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and send in some feedback. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and an Associate Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation, with me playing role of host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, all tasks for which I have no training. But I am passionate about the North American West, so this difficult work is well worth the excuse to read more books and talk to interesting people. At the end of each episode, I'll include a little bit more information about me and my scholarship, and about the Redd Center, our public programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. With that, let me introduce a little bit more about today's guest and why we're talking to them. Christian S. Harrison is an environmental historian in the state of Nevada. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, teaches government at Coronado High School in Henderson, Nevada, and is a board member of the nonprofit Preserve Nevada, where he works to engage public school teachers in historic preservation efforts throughout the state. His book that we discuss today, All the Water the Law Allows, Las Vegas and Colorado River Politics, was published by the University of Oklahoma Press in 2021 in their The Environment in Modern North America series. In this book, Harrison dives deep into the history of water usage and management in the greater Las Vegas region. From a relatively small population that thrived mostly off groundwater alone into the mid-20th century, rapid growth in the second half of the 20th century in Las Vegas led to their drawing Colorado River water, as well as the creation of a unique region-wide water agency, the Southern Nevada Water Authority, or SNWA, which eventually came to essentially represent the entire state in negotiations with the federal government and other states over water allocations from the Colorado River. It is a unique story, and Harrison's in-depth narration lays bare pitfalls and possibilities that water users, municipalities, large regions, and entire states across the West would be wise to study. The intersecting crises of water shortages, climate change, and rapid population growth in the Southwest demand we pay attention. These problems won't solve themselves, and Harrison offers us glimpses of potential ways to work our way through them. Dr. Christian S. Harrison, welcome to Writing Westward.
Hello.
Unfortunately, your book on water and water management and drought is very timely. It's kind of sad when we work on challenging topics and they continue to be challenging. We haven't solved the problems, have we?
Right. In a way, it's kind of, I guess it's both the best case scenario and the worst case scenario for a historian. We like to dig into the archives and make sure that everything we're talking about is deep in the past, and people who are alive can't immediately fact check you. So that's one of the disconcerting things about this. Not that I lack confidence in my research skills. It's just the complexity of dealing with the history of the Colorado River is truly daunting. So that's kind of, I'm glad it's relevant, but in the back of my mind, I'm just waiting for that fact checker to say, hey, you know what, you got this wrong. So so far so good, but yeah, it is certainly a relevant topic these days.
Yeah, and as as politicians and policymakers and just general citizens are desperate for answers when there are these pressing problems, and they turn to us because our work is suddenly relevant. But generally, there's no simple, easy answers, which is not
Right.
always what they want to hear. So that can be frustrating as well. But in recent weeks, or I mean, in the last month or so, there's been quite a few headlines. The low levels of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, getting close to dead pool
Hmm.
levels, the resurfacing of archaeological sites that had been flooded, the resurfacing of dead bodies in barrels that mobsters,
Right.
or someone dumped in Lake Mead. Uh, we're coming up on the 100-year anniversary of the Colorado River Compact in November, right?
Right. Right.
And then I think I sent you an email, but just last week, John Oliver's Last Week Tonight program on HBO did a whole feature on water in which he
Right.
talked quite a bit about Las Vegas. So you're in the news. This is I couldn't have picked a better book for this month, I guess.
Awesome. Yeah, there is a lot of sensational news coming out, with the dead bodies and barrels, but um, the big story, of course, is just the widespread um, water shortage that is being felt across this broad region. And what it's nice that people are noticing now, but like this is we're in the final phases of like before there's real problems. This has been a problem that we've known about for many years. But we're only now, the feet are truly to the fire. Humans are terrible at long range, kind of like let's plan for the future kind of a thing. We do much better if it's staring us in the face. And at least there's that. People are actually starting to take action. You can see this around Las Vegas for a long time. Here in Vegas, during the 90s, early 2000s, you had a lot of turf removal was kind of the big thing, and that's very important. Getting rid of grass, that does save a huge amount of water. In fact, at first, and it might still be the case, that's the largest user of water in the Las Vegas Valley, vastly more than anything the casinos use. And so you're starting to see that again just through my own neighborhood, a lot of the common throughways,
More
and
desert
in these,
landscaping now.
yeah, they're just yanking that stuff out, and it's really quite obvious. It's going on a lot of places.
But unfortunately, with these things, it's like turning a battleship. It takes a long time sometimes
Yeah,
to
you
build the
needed to be.
infrastructures or policies to make big impacts on this. And so,
Yeah, you had to be turning the battleship, years ago. So it's something, and it's encouraging to see that there is action being taken. But even so, I don't think people, driving by truly understand. Oh well, hey, they're pulling grass out, but I would say that there are people who are truly freaking out, and then people who are totally, um, ignorant to the whole thing. And I see this with my students. I teach high school seniors, so 17 and 18-year-olds, and I will routinely just survey the class and just to get a sense of water usage, understanding of water. It's not great, and I think that that's just kind of a mirror into society at large. Is we just don't really understand water infrastructure because one, it works too well. If it works well, people get angry at it. This is the things like, when people don't have enough to worry about, they start attacking things like public schools, like, water infrastructure, because it's essentially working too well. And so, I know that this is an old adage, but I heard it used by um, Pat Mulroy, the SNWA, former SNWA general manager, somebody told her, unfortunately, you do your job too well. You've gotten water too well to the people of Las Vegas, and they don't really understand that there's a shortage out there. And we're starting to see that, and when you have lake levels that are obviously dropping, you can go out there and you can see the infrastructure at the head of the Hoover Dam is now exposed. Now you got something, and people can kind of, really sink their teeth into that. But for the longest time, there just wasn't an understanding. Well, people just didn't care because there wasn't an understanding of the interconnectedness of this Western economy, this broad shift to urban, living, the complete, obsolescence of agriculture in the West outside of just a couple of places. And so just like these larger trends, people just were not aware of. And so now, yeah, you're starting to see it. Um, but, as a historian, I taking that kind of step back, what I hear a lot is people scrambling. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And the one thing that I keep coming back to is probably the most objective viewpoint that is possible is you're not ever this isn't going to work for everybody. Not everybody's going to get what they want. And so what you hear now is this kind of scrambling as if there's a path forward for everyone to get what they want. And it's just not going to be the case, and especially if you take, broad perspectives, and we're like 6, 7, 800 years worth of perspective, and you see how humans have dealt with climate change and changing water levels, just things that have happened on a broad global scale. Bad stuff can happen, and we're fortunately in a good spot because we have such a deeply integrated, comprehensive infrastructure. We'll be able to weather. People are not going to starve. You probably won't have like mass migrations, but all the same, certain economic activities like growing alfalfa in the Great Basin, what are we doing? So those kinds of things need to be addressed. And right now, when you hear, John Oliver talking, it's almost like, people still kind of think, oh, well, we'll be able to get, technology can get us through this and everyone's going to still get to do what they want. And unfortunately, I just don't see that being in the future. I think there's going to be some massive changes that people just can't envision now because certain things have happened here in the West for so long. But those things happen until they don't. And I think that we're probably a lot closer to that moment than people realize.
It's really easy for suburban and urban Westerners to take water for granted. We turn the tap on and water comes out. Uh, there are some rural communities who've felt this a little more acutely, where their well water levels, the water tables drop so far that their wells aren't producing water anymore. But for most of us in these big cities, we don't have to reckon with the fact that it's a finite resource, that there is only so much water. Even before we get into the messiness of how it's been over allocated and apportioned between the states, which we'll get to in a second. Most of us can just turn on a tap and have a nice drink of water. So the immediacy of the crisis is not, it's harder for a lot of us to feel.
Well, and I think though that the crisis and the acute feeling in a suburban resident such as you and me, it's kind of been outsourced. It's not that in one sense, yeah, people ought to know better. They ought to have a greater awareness, but water agencies are also making sure that those suburban urban residents are actually paying closer to the true cost of water. And so while they may not have a conscious understanding of the value of water, they are paying through the nose for it.
Our water bills are going up.
We're seeing huge water bills that that is simply not uniform throughout the region. So yes, you've got rural folk who are at least more aware of the water, but in many cases, it's us who are actually subsidizing that. It's the nation who's subsidizing the lower cost of water. And when you're looking at the value of water and this acute problem that we face, that's one of those things that has to be discussed.
Yeah.
Because it's like trying to do math and not use numbers. It's just like, okay, you've got to face reality here. There's only so much to go around. There's this many people. This is not the place for myth making.
Yeah.
We have to face the cold hard reality here.
Well, let's roll back the clock and go back 100 years to 1922 and the Colorado River Compact, or Law of the River. Can you describe? I think a lot of Westerners are vaguely aware of it, but who are the states involved, and what were the provisions of this water sharing agreement for the Colorado River that they made?
Well, so the Colorado River Compact and Law of the River, I guess you could argue that they are two separate things. The Law of the River encompasses the Colorado River Compact. Let's start there. So the Law of the River is just simply every congressional bill, every federal legal statute, every court ruling, every interstate compact that deals with the Colorado River ever is part of the Law of the River. It's kind of a common law situation, just this agglomeration of laws over the span of 100 years, some of which reinforce each other, and others that are seemingly contradictory, but they're still within the Law of the River. But then you have the Colorado River Compact, which is an interstate compact between, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Nevada. So the seven states that hydrologically possess the Colorado River drainage. And so those seven states, I wouldn't say it was a smooth process. It took over a decade, but they finally came together in 1922 and agreed to share. Agreed to certain provisions on sharing the Colorado River, because it's an agreement among states. It's protected under the compact clause of the Constitution. So these states could essentially create policy that applied only to these states, as long as it doesn't supersede or threaten the supremacy of Congress. And so that's allowed under the Constitution, and that's what these seven states did. So basically, the main driver to get the compact agreed to was California. Very early on, it was economically advanced. You had residents in the Imperial Valley who could put that water to use, the Colorado River. And under Western water law, you have the doctrine of prior appropriation, and basically, like within a state, if a user puts water to use first, they get rights to that water as long as they keep using that water. What's the word? Beneficial use. So every single year, if you are proving that you are using this water beneficially, then you get rights to that water. The water doesn't necessarily have to go through your property. You can redirect it from afar. And this comes from the gold fields of California, where miners saw a stream, across a ridge line. They rerouted that stream using flumes and whatnot, and they were able to use that water. So we actually get this law from the miners. So up until 1920s, states thought, okay, well, you got this appropriation law, but it only applies within a state's borders. Supreme Court ruled, I believe it was in 1921, that actually if a state adheres to prior appropriation, then that law can actually go beyond state borders too. And so the implications for the basin were, if California could put the Colorado River to beneficial use first, it could hypothetically claim 100% of the flow of that river. So that's, got every state started, jumping through hoops and saying, okay, we have to prevent this. And the way they were going to prevent that was to stymie. California, more than anything, wanted a dam on the Colorado River. This was going to be an immense expenditure. Wanted to use federal funds for this. This was the way that the other states could kind of check California in a way. And so that was the carrot and the stick there. And so the other states, ultimately agreed to support California's bid for the dam and for all the development in Southern California in the Imperial Valley, as long as it limited itself to a particular amount of water. And, that was not actually set during those initial negotiations. The only allocations that were decided in 1922 were that the upper basin, one, that you would have an upper and a lower basin. The upper basin would be Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico. And then the lower basin would be Arizona, Nevada, and California. And you would separate those two basins and then allocate what they thought was half the river's flow. And so 7.5 million per basin, which was not
what's the
accurate.
problem with that number?
It's drastically inflated. And
even during wet periods, that's more water than the
and that was
right?
That was an abnormally wet period. But also, John Fleck points this out in his recent book too. They understood that there was more, like they were asking for more than was available even then. There's just so much wishful thinking involved in the historical record with this river. It's just amazing. So they were asking for more water than was available, but this was all about negotiating positions in an interstate political realm. That science was a minor player. It really was. They're trying to kind of just do a lot of legal combat. And so, they divided this river upper and lower, and then the individual states didn't get those allocations until quite a bit later, but they didn't have to worry about that at the time. Now, they may have over allocated per basin, but at the time that didn't matter. There was plenty of water.
The population demands weren't maxing it.
Yeah, there was no shortage.
Yeah.
But
and each state in those negotiations, each state had the incentive or the desire to argue for as big of an allocation as possible, even if they weren't conceivably going to use it in the next few decades, because they hope that at some point in the future they would, right? And it's a pie, and there's only so many pieces, and
right.
If the next state over gets a bigger slice of the pie, that's a smaller piece for you, right? It's a zero-sum game.
This is it very much was. There was no, and Nevada, I've always, like to point this out, Nevada got by far the smallest amount of water. And I don't actually know this, but our negotiator was an engineer, and I just he asked for as much water as could irrigate the known irrigable acreage in Nevada. Like pure math is how he applied this logic. And he actually, suggested we get less. And Nevada gets 300,000 acre feet of water per year. Now, an acre foot in this era could probably support one family of 6 or 2 families of 4 suburban families per year. So it's 326,000 gallons. So it's a lot of water. California got 4.4 million. Arizona was holding out for nearly 3 million. And so you look at those vast amounts, and this guy, he's asking for 300,000, and you look at it, mathematically, I read the transcript about how he calculated this, and I thought that's cute. Like this guy thinks that this is about math, and California and Arizona, come with their phalanx of lawyers, and they
It's
don't
about
care about
politics.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's about how much can
Yeah.
we legally claim here, science be damned. So um, yeah, it's just at the beginning, it just really wasn't all that much of a concern because this river was just, it was a big river,
Kind of this myth of overabundance that we see throughout the West, right? There's no way we
right?
could cut down all the trees, no way that we could use up all the water because there's just so
Right.
much. Let's pivot to Nevada and Las Vegas. So your book is not a book about the Colorado River or the entire basin. It's really about Las Vegas and how Las Vegas managed its water. One thing that I didn't know that really shocked me, well, many things that I didn't know that I learned in your book, was that Las Vegas doesn't use its allocation um, until the 1970s. So there's a almost 50-year period between when Nevada, the Vegas region, actually starts pulling water out. So what are they doing during those interceding decades? Where are they getting their water?
There was a small, just as a little caveat, the city was able to tap into Lake Mead starting in the 40s with a tiny little pipeline. Now the city is the only place in Nevada that can really utilize Nevada's allocation. And so it's not like, we have to distribute our water up to Elko or, Reno or anything like that. So the only hydrologically logical place that we can use the water is here. So for all intents and purposes, Las Vegas is Nevada when it
Mm.
comes to the state's allocation. So the allocation is 300,000 acre feet. There was a small pipeline that the military put in place during the 1940s to help support military operations and munitions production here. And it was about 40,000 acre feet. And so that helped a little bit. But by and large, the city existed solely on groundwater. And this was up until 1972. Now, it's an interesting process because it's as if Las Vegas is both before and after these larger trends in many ways. In this case, you can watch how, on a micro scale, water managers are dealing with problems here that we're now dealing with throughout the West. So they had what they thought was an abundant supply of groundwater. The original inhabitants of the city were just drilling wells left and right. Once they did it was like, the old oil derricks that would just explode into the air. That was how much pressure. These were artesian, as the term. An artesian well is when there's so much groundwater or pressure that it just shoots the water out. And so if you drill down, it didn't take too far to hit the aquifers. And once you did, the water was under pressure, and so just come immediately to the surface. Now, it wasn't like a geyser or anything, but it would be like a decorative fountain for your front yard, like a big stream of water that could be, just bubbling 2 or 3 feet in the air. The literature at the time just indicated just the most outrageous thinking on this. Like there was actual thoughts that there was a underground river from Tahoe and Pyramid all the way down here to the Vegas Valley. It's 400 miles of underground river, but people actually believe this.
So they're thinking that this aquifer is just going to indefinitely recharge itself.
Yeah,
because
there's
it's
no
coming from
danger.
some far off source.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no danger. And so the hydrological components of these aquifers were not known in any sense really until the 1940s, when the railroad. Well, it might have been a little bit before, but you start to see government surveys occurring in the 40s. They gave the community a much better understanding of where the water comes from, how much there is. And it was during that decade that they found, I'm not sure how if you or the listeners are familiar with Las Vegas, but to the north and the west of the city are two mountain ranges, both of which one is just under 10,000 feet and the other is just over 10,000 feet. So they can capture significant amounts of moisture in the winter and the summer during the monsoonal season. And those mountains, over the span of millions of years, were collecting water, and it was then percolating down the mountainsides through the gravel and then under into the Las Vegas Valley. And so the Las Vegas Valley was actually quite verdant. It was a logical place for people to stop. There were huge mesquite tree bogs. It looked rather inviting compared to the Mojave Desert around it. So that's initially what attracted European settlers here. It attracted the railroad because there was an obvious source of water here. And once the railroad came to town, like you had some minor ranching that really had very little effect. But once it went to the railroad, you have an industrial use of water, and then it becomes commoditized. And that's when you really start to see this. These mountains are no longer able to generate enough water. They can't produce enough water to outpace what's now being used by the railroad. The railroad is the main economic driver, not only for Vegas, but most cities in the West at the time. And so it brought all kinds of settlers here who then started just tapping their own water. And it was just this weird situation too. You look back, the entire city was essentially just a company town. And it's weird to read transcripts where like you're looking at water managers, but they're railroad employees, but they're also like city managers too. They have to like dictate, where's the new subdivision going? How much are we going to charge for water? So it was just kind of this private city, really. And so you have this economic driver that then starts, attracting people here, and the understanding of the water use is just like there's no understanding of it. People are planting lawns. One of the stories I've seen in several places, in fact, Richard Bryan, the former senator from the state, former governor as well, he and I are on a Preserve Nevada board together, and I'm always he's in his 80s and he grew up here, and so he's just got the most amazing stories about Vegas. He said as a kid he had neighbors who would hire him to just turn on the spigot when they would go up to Mount Charleston. That's one of those mountain ranges I mentioned earlier. They'd go up there to camp for the weekend, and they would just leave the sprinkler on all weekend, just to make sure that the grass didn't die. So that was a pretty common thing. That was a common understanding about that. That was a common practice with water. It was, during the 40s and 50s with World War II, really ramping up the local economy, the post-war years when tourism becomes a viable economic endeavor. That's when you start to the locals came together and finally, we have to come up with a water district to manage the water. Mm-hmm. And then once you have that, then you have this, just proliferation of information. And then this kind of cold, hard reality started staring folks in the face. And so in the 40s and 50s, local water managers realize, oh my gosh, we have to do something. We have to tap into Lake Mead. And so it's interesting in one sense in that they all realize that now we have a finite resource, truly finite, because we're talking about groundwater. But conservation was not the key. It was building that infrastructure out to Lake Mead.
Because there we have an infinite resource, right?
Yes.
So don't worry about the groundwater or saving water. We just need to worry about infrastructure, right, and bring in this other source. So by the 70s and 80s, though, population now has far outpaced the available water or the available infrastructure. right? And
It would
you have
have,
all these different municipalities and different water districts drilling wells, pulling as much water as they can, right?
right, right. You do have the Las Vegas Valley Water District was the kind of the first metropolitan style agency here, where it could, it could transcend, municipal boundaries. But you still had a lot of individuals who were able to drill their own water. And so, the district for many years had a concerted effort to buy those people out and put them onto this centralized system. Um, but
How does this then shift to the SNWA? So the Southern Nevada Water Authority becomes
okay,
eventually, which is formed in the what year is it?
91.
91.
Yeah,
How does that replace and kind of supersede the different municipalities and this kind of, you know, I mean, you use the term like balkanized, right? Like this hodgepodge
right,
of
right.
this patchwork of different water districts. How does the SNWA form to kind of control the whole region? And why was that the solution that was sought for these problems?
Well, I think in some ways you have the Las Vegas Valley Water District was in like very much a precursor of what the SNWA later became. It was metropolitan in scope. It had territory, but it was not. It didn't envision the rise of North Las Vegas, of Boulder City, of Henderson. Those were really far off. If you're, in downtown Henderson and you drive to northwest part of Las Vegas now, that's 35 miles. So in the 1940s, Henderson was an ammo production site and a company town. It was way out there.
Not even a suburb.
And now, no,
Yeah.
it's suburb has a nice connotation as to where you'd want to live. This was a grungy, kind of, beat down blue collar kind of company town. So it did not have the reputation it does today. Same with North Las Vegas. That was a military site. Nellis Air Force Base is there now. Um, these were all highly disparate communities, and Las Vegas was, the downtown Las Vegas, you had the strip casinos, but there was nothing on either side of the strip casinos. They were just simply casinos along a freeway or a highway. So the district did fine under those conditions. But then when you start to have that metropolitan growth where you have infill and suburban growth everywhere, then you have these entities with their own history, and they're going to start protecting their water rights. They were not part of the district earlier. They had their own water rights allocated to them, I think by the federal government at the time, because they were military installations, then transferred to the state. So they were protecting that. And now those cities then started to really push for development and for real estate development, and building more houses, businesses. They wanted to grow. And so in the 70s and 80s, you start to see this metropolitan growth really kick off in the valley. It was between 1970 and 1980. I think the city doubled in size. It's never done that. That was the biggest lurch forward for all the talk of Las Vegas's growth. It never grew by a factor of two. So
And
in
by
that
Las Vegas,
decade,
do you mean kind of like the entire
the
Vegas
yes,
area? Now
the
starting to
metro
include
area,
Henderson and some of these other places that
right?
are part of the metro. Okay.
Right, the metro area. So, it started off at, quarter of a million in 1970 and jumps to, nearly 500,000 a decade later. That was massive, and that's the key decade where they finally tapped into the Colorado River. And once they got that first pipeline in 72, There you can read that kind of like, oh, we're saved, it's never going to end. And then by the early 1980s, like less than 8 years later, they're like, oh my God, not only do we need to build the second part of the pipeline, because the first pipeline only got 150,000 acre feet to the city. But then they started talking about not only do they need to build the second pipeline, but now we really need to do something as to curb the waste, to do something because we're going to run out of that too. So yeah, the 1980s, there was this kind of, they're doing the same thing over. They realize, okay, we don't have enough water here. What are we going to do? A lot of the reason for lack of water was there was no comprehensive plan for the community. It was, your classic tragedy of the commons. Everybody's using their individual allocations. Each city had an individual allocation through the state. And basically, so Henderson would approach, the Colorado River Commission, which is a state agency. And that's how they got their water from the Colorado River. Now, the Colorado River Commission essentially based each city's allocation on what they used the year before.
So they want to use as much as they can. So they get
right.
a bigger, yeah.
Yes. So it's the whole use it or lose it, philosophy. And you're having the tragedy of the commons. Nobody's really concerned about conserving because they see the city across the way making money hand over fist because they're going ahead and using all their water for development.
So this system leads to inefficiency, waste, competitive use of a finite resource, which is kind of bonkers to wrap your head around. So the SNWA then is formed to try to take the entire region and run it all more efficiently. Conserve
to
more
consolidate
water.
the water. Yeah, and not to mention a toxic political culture down here too, where all these cities are just eyeballing each other with the deepest suspicion.
Rightfully so, probably.
And you can read transcripts, like people were literally yelling at each other at these planning meetings over water, and just like really nasty to each other. And so, the SNWA came out of this because you had a few people within this water community who could see the road ahead and realized this isn't going to work. We need to figure this out, and started to, extend olive branches and proposals as to, okay, let's get together. Let's start a planning process here. And so ultimately, that shortage of the 1980s and political toxicity ironically led to this cohesive unit, the SNWA, which then took control of the state's water allocation.
I want to get to that eventually, because the SNWA morphs into something I did not expect or was not aware of. But first, is this kind of metropolitan wide kind of super water agency, is that something that's unique to Las Vegas, or is this something we see in other large metropolitan areas in the Southwest? Have they gone through similar processes of kind of a balkanized patchwork of districts that then coalesce into a big mega district?
This is unique. There's no other metro area in the West where the entirety of the local water supply is administered by one.
Why do you think that happened in Vegas and say not Phoenix or Salt Lake or any other number of big metro areas?
Two reasons primarily. I think one is that it's comparatively new. All of Vegas's growth occurred in the 20th century, and so it didn't have as deep-seated community allegiances, that you find in Arizona, which is truly ancient. When you think about like how long people have been living there, various cultures. California, there just wasn't the length of time here and tied to that land, because you really couldn't. California, throw anything on the ground, it's going to grow. You can make an economy in so many different places in California, where then people can move and devote their lives to and then protect and work to protect. You just didn't have that here in Las Vegas. Um, Two, the only place you can use the state's water is here. And so there's no contenders beyond the horizon. Whereas, Tucson and Phoenix are vying for the same water hundreds of miles apart. And so, again, this is the only place that could happen. And so it was uniquely advantaged in that sense.
So this is where we get another thing that really I just never thought of, and it's really intuitive once, as you've already kind of explained it. The SNWA, which is a regional, like multi-municipal water agency, um, essentially becomes the water agency for the entire state of Nevada, because it's especially in terms of the Colorado River Compact and this interstate competition for that water. The rest of the state of Nevada has nothing to gain or benefit. Like, they're not going to be using that water. And so you now have a local, uh, city water agency engaging in interstate negotiations and politics, which
Right, right.
I don't think I've seen that examples of something like that happening elsewhere in the West.
Not in this sense. Now, just to be clear, I mean, California, or the SNWA is essentially on a state level. It makes no decisions over water that don't deal with the Colorado River, though. And so, while it is kind of like this quasi-state agency, it has no impact on Reno or Carson City, things that are hydrologically unrelated to the Colorado River.
But are
And
Reno
so
or
again,
Carson City, Elko, are they competing with other states for their water?
no,
Like, they're kind of more self-contained within the state.
they are, and that, of course, we could definitely have a conversation about Reno, because I think that their time is coming, and I think the SNWA actually serves as kind of a potential lesson for that, because Reno gets its water from a California-based source. Um, so again, but that they have a whole different interstate situation up there, and so the reality on the ground is there's simply no way that Northern Nevada can use anything Las Vegas has hydrologically. And so within that realm, the SNWA leadership really pushed for a seat at the table with respect to like Nevada agencies, the ability to negotiate for water, because all of the water that the state is allotted can only be used here. And so locals wanted the ability to navigate that political context. In some ways, I'm sure there are hydrologists up in Reno who are able, negotiators, but the pride, I think, kind of got into it too, where hey, the rest of the state has nothing to do with what we're dealing with down here. We need to be able to have some control over our destiny. And so you saw a major push locally for the Colorado River Commission, which is part of the executive branch of the state of Nevada, to be recomprised. It used to have five governors appointees. What didn't matter where the governor was from. The governor would have the choice to appoint the five members of this commission, which would then have the legal authority to negotiate with the Bureau of Reclamation and in any interstate negotiations. So the SNWA pushed to recomprise that so that the new composition is seven members, three of whom are SNWA appointees. And so that gives them, a major voting block on this state level agency, which brings them to this. Essentially, they are a state level agency in everything but name only. And so I don't know if people realized how weird it was that Pat Mulroy was talking with, the president of Mexico, the governor of Colorado, all of these high level, the secretary of interior. Why do you have a local Las Vegan who is driving negotiations for an interstate river? And that is a huge story. And just like when you know I guess, being a government teacher, I can understand why people don't have as clear an idea on federalism as I would like them to. However, that's still weird, when you're thinking about a local who is able to negotiate with the governor of Colorado. That's not normal,
Yeah.
and so it is a unique situation here, in a position that the SNWA, to my mind, I have not seen too many agencies, certainly not a water agency. You might have some, the Harbors Commission in, New York, certain
Yeah.
things like that. But
Like some
that's
port
as
commissions
close
that
as I've
maybe have
seen.
outsized uh,
Yeah, yeah. But
authority or
aside from that,
influence.
I've never seen anything like that.
Well, as we kind of wrap up, I wanted to move towards the present and ask what lessons Las Vegas may have to offer to the rest of the West and especially the Southwest. But I guess one problem with that question is the Las Vegas situation so unique that there's not many applicable lessons for the rest of us to learn? Or do you think there's things, because the rest of us we don't have these a huge SNWA running entire regions, um, and hydrologically we're all in very different situations as well. So uh, what lessons do you think that Vegas can offer if Salt Lake or Phoenix or Tucson or think about like St. George, Utah, who, just right up the
Right,
road from
right.
you, who's now talking about building I don't know how many $1 billion pipeline, 300 miles. I don't remember how many miles it is over to Lake Powell to apparently draw water out of Lake Powell, which itself is
Yeah,
almost at Deadpool level. Right. And anyway, so
that, yeah.
what lessons should the rest of us take from your very in-depth look at how Vegas has negotiated all of this over the last 100 plus years?
Well, I guess like it's just like kind of everybody's automatic response anymore to talk about, oh, how hard everything is for the Colorado River. Oh God, the politics. Oh, it's like, okay, all right, fine, we get that. What the SNWA example proves, though, is that when people's backs against the wall, they can act collectively, and the the reality, the difficulty, the fear that water managers are feeling throughout the Colorado River Basin is no more acute, no different than the fear that locals felt here. So yeah, so the scale is different, but you can't say that one person's fear isn't as valid as the next. Okay, so you have the same mentalities that were in place in 91 locally as are in place here now nationally or regionally. So when local governments here realized that they either work together or they run out of water, they took action. I think that this idea, this realization, of course, it's going to take longer period of time to settle in on a regional scale, but I think we're there. And I still hear pie in the sky. I mean, clearly the St. George pipeline is the most absurd thing. It doesn't make sense hydrologically, legally. There's no, that's simply pushing for a better negotiating position, and that's a sheer act of desperation. I can't believe that anyone involved in that actually thinks that's going to work. So you have this understanding of shortage and reality, but it just takes some time before the stark reality of that settles in. Now, the one thing that I still don't think people are properly internalizing it. And this is part of that process of understanding, what are the actual limits, is, the United States' relationship to Mexico and to Native Americans. Now, Mexico,
not a part of the Colorado River Compact, but water users of the
right.
Colorado River.
So in both cases, that's correct. However, Mexico that's at the national level. That is an interstate. That's an international issue that would supersede anything that the compact had. If push came to shove, the national government would have to make sure that Mexico gets that water. Now, what we could see is, these dark moods where I'll kind of go down a rabbit hole and think, okay, if that happened, then you would see the Secretary of Interior telling all states in the basin, sorry, but Mexico gets their water. That's because it's an international issue, the purview of the federal government. What I then see is like this new round of sagebrush rebels who are not facing reality themselves, but just want to hoard the water from the Colorado River. So you've got that dynamic, which is very serious. The international nature of this river, the binational nature. Those farmers down in Mexico are every bit as dependent on that same river as some of the hysterics that you hear above the border. But it's like this kind of, again, it's we talk about this river as if Mexico doesn't exist, and it's like that needs to be front and center. And then Native American rights. If we're a nation that believes in the rule of law, Native Americans are going to get the water.
Especially if you're talking prior appropriation,
Yeah, you can either say no, they're not going to get the water, which certainly has precedent in this in nation's history, but you can't also then say that we believe in the rule of law, because with the Winters Doctrine or the Winters decision, those are very solid rights for American Indians, and it's only going to get worse. That's the thing, is we think we're in a shortage now, and we're already like we're starting to really we got to do something. We have still not truly acknowledged Native American rights and Mexican water rights, and so until that's all just like on the table, and we finally we're exhausted because we've just had this knockdown drag out fight with our family members in the basin, and you're exhausted from the fight. That's where we need to be before we can really kind of move forward. Now, the SNWA, they got to that point. The negotiators, they were exhausted. They realized there's just no way forward unless we do this. I think I hope we get there within the basin, within enough time that there's still water. But I don't think we're there yet. So I am being a little bit, I always feel a little embarrassed when I voice optimistic opinions. So I'll say it with that caveat, but I do think that because it's been done in the Las Vegas Valley, that proves humans are capable of working together on a regional level. And I think that the conditions could be just about right, basin-wide, for us to start having that actual discussion. And as I proposed in the book, an addition, like a new layer to an interstate compact, where you now have something akin to NATO, like a multi-state agency with members from each state that can then make decisions based on water allocations and water policy at that regional level.
Well, that's surprisingly optimistic. I'd much rather end on that than some dark, horrible. I've mentioned, I think on the podcast before, one time I was driving down to Monument Valley to run an ultra marathon, and I was listening to an audiobook during the drive and then while I was running, and it was this post-apocalyptic Southwest book called The Water Knife about,
And funny.
and I was like, why did I choose? Like, so I'm out there like really thirsty running this ultra marathon. I'm like, this was not the book to choose. This book about lack of water and people, going thirsty. But so your ending statements are much more optimistic.
Well, I stopped listening to that book, doing much the same. I was doing some mountain biking out here in the desert, and I would listen to that on my mountain bike rides, and it was just as dusty as Monument Valley.
Yeah.
And I stopped listening to it because I'm like, this is just the most, it's just awful. Like the imagery that, he was conveying, and great story. Although I just can't see, well, no, I don't see that happening. But yes, I know the book that you're talking about. I knew, in fact, the second you started talking, I'm like, I bet it's The Water Knife.
The Water Knife. Yeah. Well, what are you working on next? And then, we probably should let our listeners go.
Okay. Well, two things. I'm getting more into public educational policy, so I'm pursuing avenues in that realm. I'm very interested in how public schools teach social studies, specifically civics education. But aside from that, also looking at broader Colorado River history, environmental history, looking at the basin as a whole, spending less time on the current situation and looking much more at archaeological, ancient history as well, just to get a better sense of this region, which is just incredibly climatologically volatile for all of its history. And so I think that has a lot of applicability now, because I think we've really we've convinced ourselves that what we see outside is some type of static reality. And these things can really change. And it's had an impact on the human societies that have lived here, in prehistory and in historical times. So that's just something I'm really interested in, and potentially write a book about that someday.
Great. Well, I hope you do. Thanks for spending some time with us. Congrats on this book. I've been waiting. I mean, I've known you for a while, and I've been waiting for this book for some time. So I'm excited to see it out here for us. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
All right. Take care, Christian. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, or follow us on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast, or on Twitter at Writing West, where you can get updates and leave comments. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We're an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understandings about the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream, have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product can apply. Learn more at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's REDD Center. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. Find him at Micah Dahl Dahl Anderson with an O.com. I'll put a link in the episode description. My name is Brendan Rensink. I serve as the podcast host, producer, and just about everything else, so you can direct any praise or critique my way. I'm author and editor of a number of books on the West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. Recently, my book, Native But Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, published by Texas A&M University Press in 2018, won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. In an anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen entitled Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, published by the University of Utah Press in 2019, won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association. Here at the Red Center, I'm also general editor and project manager of a great digital history, public history project named Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written microhistories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink, that's RENSINK.org, or follow me on Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, and be kind. Cheers.